He had nothing left but debt and a missing herd. She fixed half of that in an afternoon. The letter from Greaves arrived on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesday was the day I always did the fence line on the north pasture, and the ink had run a little from the rain, and I had to hold it close to read it, and it said what I already knew it was going to say. 60 days. I put it in my coat pocket and walked the fence line anyway. Habit, I guess, or maybe I just needed to keep moving. The herd had been gone 11 days by then. 43 head of Black Angus, my whole breeding stock minus 3 old cows I'd left penned near the barn. I'd found the gate cut, not broken, not pushed through, but cut with pliers, clean as you please, and the tracks heading northeast toward the Mineral Creek drainage before the rain came and washed them out. I'd ridden 2 days, found nothing, come home to an empty pasture and a note from Greaves about the loan. My name is Calhoun, Harlan Calhoun. I was 54 that summer and I had 3 things to my name: the deed to the Barrow Creek Ranch, which Greaves held paper on, a roan mare named Duster who was getting arthritis in her left foreleg, and about $400 in a coffee tin under the floorboard in the kitchen that I'd been meaning to use to buy seed corn. I hadn't slept more than a few hours at a stretch since the cattle went missing. You don't, when the thing you built your whole life around is just gone. You lie in the dark and you run the numbers and the numbers don't change, and you run them again anyway. My wife had died 4 years before. Ruth. Pneumonia the winter of '91. She'd have known what to do. She always did. I'd gotten slower at decisions without her. More careful maybe, or maybe just more tired, I was never sure which. My nearest neighbor was a woman named Clara Maddock. She ran the old Reardon place about 1.5 miles south of me along the creek, 200 acres, a small herd of her own, a kitchen garden that was the most orderly thing in the county. Her husband Tom had been dead 7 years. She was maybe 48, 49. I'd seen her at the feed store, at church when I went, which was not often, once at a property line dispute with the Kelso brothers that she settled in about 10 minutes by producing a survey map from her coat pocket that she'd had the county assessor sign and stamp 3 months before. The Kelso brothers hadn't known what to say. Neither had I, watching from the road. We were friendly, Clara and I, not close. She'd brought a pot of soup the week Ruth died, and we talked for about an hour, and then she'd gone home, and that had been mostly it. A wave across a fence, a word at the feed store. 11 years as neighbors, and I knew her less than I knew the man who ran the telegraph office. She showed up at my gate on the 12th morning. I was in the barn trying to fix a broken singletree, and I heard hoofbeats and looked up, and she was there on a gray gelding I didn't recognize, which meant she'd gotten a new horse since I last paid attention. She had a canvas bag hung across the saddle horn, and she was looking at the empty pasture the way people look at a grave. I came out of the barn. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the empty pasture and then at me. "I heard about the cattle," she said. "Word travels. Silas Prout told my hired man, said your gate was cut." "That's right." She looked at me for a moment with those dark eyes. Clara Maddock had a way of looking at a person that made you feel she was reading something written a little behind your face. I'd noticed it before, and it made me vaguely uncomfortable, and I still don't know why. "You rode northeast," she said. 2 days, lost the tracks in the rain. I know a man who runs cattle in the Mineral Creek country, Abel Torrance. He's been complaining about strangers moving through his range for the past 2 weeks. She paused. He didn't mention anything about stolen stock, but Abel Torrance doesn't always say what he knows. "I don't know Torrance." "I do." She looked at the pasture again. "I thought I'd ride up there today if you wanted to come." I stood there a second. I'm not sure what I felt exactly. Something that was almost embarrassing, how grateful I was that she was standing there. A person who came when you were drowning and just said, "I know which way to swim." I hadn't felt that since Ruth. "I can be ready in 20 minutes, I said. She nodded. I'll water my horse. We rode northeast. It was about 12 miles to Torrance's upper range, and we made good time because Clara rode like she did everything else, efficient, no wasted motion, none of the fidgeting that some riders do. We didn't talk much in the first hour. The country up there was prettier than I remembered, the hills still green from the June rains, the creek running clear. I hadn't had much attention to spare for pretty country lately. After a while she said, "How much does Greaves have you down for?" I almost didn't answer. A man doesn't talk money with a neighbor generally. But there was something in the way she asked, not curious, not prying, just practical, like she was taking inventory before she helped me move furniture. 3,200, I said. She was quiet for a bit, and the cattle were worth. Wholesale, maybe 2,800, plus what I'd have gotten for the calves come fall. So the herd covers most of it. If I get the herd back. She didn't say anything to that, but she nodded once slightly. Abel Torrance's place was a rough operation up on a bench above the creek, old buildings, a big hay barn that looked newer than the rest, a considerable amount of wire and pole fencing running off in several directions. Torrance himself was a thick-necked man about 60, with a white beard and the kind of patience in his eyes that comes either from wisdom or from not being particularly quick. He came off his porch when he saw Clara, and the look on his face was complicated, pleased and slightly wary at the same time. "Mrs. Maddock," he said. "Abel," she didn't get down. "This is my neighbor Harlan Calhoun. He's missing 43 head of Black Angus. His gate was cut 12 days ago. The tracks went northeast." Torrance looked at me, then back at Clara. The wariness stayed in his eyes. "I don't know anything about stolen cattle," he said. "I know you don't," Clara said pleasantly, "but you said strangers were moving through your range. I'm wondering if they were moving cattle when they moved through." A long moment, Torrance's jaw worked a little. "There was a bunch moving through Sawmill Draw about 10 days back," he said finally. "Night traveling. I didn't go look because it wasn't my business." "Which direction were they heading?" "West, toward the Ortega brothers' buyer over in Seco Flats." Clara turned to me. I already knew what she was going to say. "The Ortega brothers," I said. "They move cattle they shouldn't move," she said, "but they do it through legitimate buyers. If your cattle are in Seco Flats, they're already sold. But," she turned back to Torrance, "Abel, who's the buyer?" Another pause, then, "Man named Hutter. Runs a stockyard on the south end of town." "Thank you, Abel." "Mrs. Maddock," he looked at her a second longer. "Calhoun, I'd have said something sooner if I'd known." "I believe that," I said, and I mostly did. We didn't go to Seco Flats that afternoon. Clara said we needed the sheriff and the bill of sale, and that riding in without them would get us nothing but trouble, and she was right. We rode back to Barrow Creek, and I put together what paperwork I had in my purchase receipts from 2 years back, the brand registration, and she wrote a letter to the county sheriff that was the most efficient and deadly piece of correspondence I'd ever read. Laid out the facts like she was stacking fence posts. No heat, no agitation, just, "Here is what happened, here is what you will find, here is what the law requires of you." "You write like a lawyer," I told her. "I was married to one," she said, without looking up from the paper. I hadn't known that. I didn't know a lot of things about Clara Maddock. She rode home before dark. I stood at my gate and watched her go, and then I went inside and ate something I barely tasted and went to bed and actually slept, for the first time in 11 days. Slept hard. Didn't dream. The sheriff rode out the next morning. He was a man named Briggs, careful and methodical, the kind of lawman who doesn't move fast but doesn't stop moving either. He took my paperwork and Clara's letter and looked at the cut gate and said he'd be in Seco Flats by end of week. He was. It took 3 weeks altogether. Hutter had bought 18 of my cattle and had already resold 8 of them, which meant I got 18 back and a judgment against the Ortegas for the cash value of the other 25. The Ortega brothers were arrested. The trial was short. The judgment took longer to collect than it should have because the Ortegas didn't have much, but I got most of it eventually, enough, with the 18 head and 2 months' patience to clear Greaves. But I'm ahead of myself. The afternoon the sheriff rode out, the morning after Clara had come and gone, she sent her hired man over with a note. Short. It said, "I have 12 bred heifers I've been meaning to thin from my herd. If you want to lease them through the fall calving season, I would take a fair rate, and it would serve us both. Let me know." I rode over that same afternoon. Her place was tidy in the way that a place gets when one person has thought hard about every part of it. The house was small but well kept, the kitchen garden running along the south wall in straight rows, the barn newer than mine and better ventilated. She was splitting wood when I came into the yard, and she set the axe down and pulled off her gloves and waited, which was her way. She didn't come to meet you. She waited and let you come to her. "The heifers," I said. 12 head, all bred, all due between October and December. You'd have calves to sell come spring. What rate? She named a number that was on the low side of fair, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and something passed between us that I still have trouble putting words to. Like she was being careful not to help me too hard, if that makes sense. Not to make it charity when it wasn't. "That works," I said. We shook on it, standing in her yard. Her hand was hard and dry, a working hand. She held the shake a second longer than strictly necessary, and then she let go and turned back toward the barn. "I'll have them moved over in the morning," she said. And that was that, or that was the beginning of it, though I didn't know that then. What I knew was that I had 12 heifers in my pasture, and a fighting chance at clearing Greaves, and a name to give the sheriff, and all of it had arrived in about a 24-hour window, because a woman I'd barely spoken to had ridden over and looked at my empty pasture and thought to herself, "Well, I know something that might help." The heifers calved out well that winter. 10 of 12 were good strong calves, and I sold 8 of them in March, and they sold for better than I'd expected. I cleared Greaves in full with 2 weeks to spare on the deadline, which I will admit I went back and read the date on the letter about 3 times to make sure I was reading it right. I brought Clara the lease payment the same afternoon I wired Greaves. Rode over with the cash counted and folded in an envelope, and found her in the kitchen garden, weeding along the bean rows with a trowel. She took the envelope, counted it without embarrassment, because she was not a woman who was embarrassed by money or the practical things that went with it. "All 10 came through," she said. 10 calves, 1 pair of twins. "Twins," she almost smiled. "That's good luck." I thought so. She put the envelope in her apron pocket. She looked at me for a moment, that look again, the one that went a little deeper than the surface, and then she went back to her weeding. "There's coffee on the stove," she said. I stood there. A man like me, you get used to handling things on your own. You get used to the feeling of being the one who carries it. 4 years since Ruth and I'd gotten pretty settled in that solitary arrangement, not because I preferred it, but because that's what there was. "I'll take a cup," I said. She nodded and kept weeding. I went inside and found the coffee and poured 2 cups and brought one back out to her, and she took it without making a production of it, and we stood in the kitchen garden while she finished the row and didn't talk much, and it was the most comfortable I'd felt in a long time. That was May. By August we'd gotten into the habit of it, me coming by on Tuesdays, her coming by on Thursdays, neither of us having discussed it or planned it. It had just become the schedule. We'd talk about fence and cattle prices, and weather and a book she was reading that I hadn't read but she'd tell me about in a way that made me want to read it. Sometimes supper. Once or twice supper ran long enough that the ride home was in full dark and I didn't mind. I'm not a man who talks easy about what he feels. Ruth used to say I communicated in gestures, which she said was not a complaint, but you got the feeling it was at least a little bit of a complaint. But with Clara, it seemed to not require less, exactly. She was paying attention to what I did, same as I was paying attention to what she did, and we both knew what we were saying without having to say all of it. One Thursday in September she came by and I was patching the south wall of the barn where a board had gone soft, and she held the new board in place while I nailed it, and it took maybe 15 minutes, and afterward she looked at the wall and said, "Better," and I said, "I should have done it 2 years ago," and she said, "You had other things," and there it was. The whole last year, everything that had happened acknowledged and set aside. You had other things. Now you don't. Here we are. I won't say it came together the way things do in a sentimental story, because that's not how it was. We were both too old for sentimental and too practical for pretending. What happened is we were two people who'd each been carrying their own lives alone for a good long while, and somewhere over those Tuesdays and Thursdays, it became clear to both of us that the carrying was lighter when the other one was there. She told me in October. She didn't say it the way a young woman says it. She said it the way a person says something they've been thinking about and have now decided is true enough to say out loud. We were on her porch after supper, and it was cold enough that we were both in coats, and the stars were out over the hills, and she said, "I think you should know that I have a considerable amount of respect for how you handled this year." I didn't answer right off. "Most men," she said, "when they're down that far, they don't take the hand that's offered. They don't like what it means." "What did it mean?" I said. She thought about it. "That someone thought you were worth helping." I sat with that for a moment. Out past the barn, the hills were dark, and the creek was a sound more than a thing you could see, and the whole world was very quiet. "It wasn't a hard decision," I said, "to take your help." "I know," she said. "That's part of what I'm saying." I reached over after a while and put my hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. She turned her hand over and held mine back. Strong grip, that working hand. We sat like that a while. Neither of us said anything more that needed saying. Come spring, I asked her to marry me. I was 55 and she was 49, and we both knew exactly what we were doing, which made it better than most proposals probably are. She said yes the way she did everything, simply and without hesitation, like she'd already thought it through, and this was just the confirmation. We moved into her place. Hers was the better house, and it made sense, and she said the arrangement was practical, and I said I agreed, and that was that. I sold the Barrow Creek deed to a young couple from Missouri who had better energy than sense, but enough of both that they'd probably make it. I watched them drive up to the gate on the 1st of April with a wagon full of their things, and the man was looking around the pasture the way I'd looked at it when I first bought it, like he was measuring himself against it, wondering if he'd be enough. He probably would be, and probably he'd have someone to help him when he wasn't. I'm old enough now that the year the cattle went missing feels like a long time ago, and also like it was last week. Time does that. Compresses and stretches depending on what you're touching. What I think about, when I think about it, and I do, some mornings, is that Tuesday with the letter from Greaves. Standing in the rain on the fence line reading words I already knew were there. A man with nothing left but debt, and a missing herd, and a coffee tin with $400 in it, and the slow grinding feeling that this was finally just too much. And then a woman I barely knew rode up to my gate the next morning on a horse I'd never seen, and looked at my empty pasture, and thought to herself that maybe she knew something that could help. She didn't have to do that. That's the part that stays with me. She didn't have to do any of it. The ride to Torrance's, the letter to the sheriff, the heifers at a fair rate instead of charity, the coffee, the Tuesdays and Thursdays that became what they became. She chose every one of those things out of her own will, the same way a person chooses to step towards something instead of away from it. A good woman like that, you don't take her for granted. You don't pretend you don't know what she did. You carry it, the way she carried things for you, and you hope that's enough to be worth the choosing. Clara's in the kitchen right now. I can hear her moving around, the particular sound of her, the weight of her step that I'd know from any other step on earth. There's a cup of coffee going cold on the table that she left for me before she started on breakfast, which is what she does every morning. And in about 20 minutes we'll sit down together and eat and talk about the fence line she wants to mend before the weather turns, and whether to sell the back pasture hay or keep it against a hard winter. Ordinary things, a life made of ordinary things. I pick up the cup. Still warm enough. Out the window the hills are this bright October gold that won't last, a week maybe, before the color goes and the cold comes. I've had worse Octobers.